The Wasp Factory. Chapter 9. What Happened to Eric. Part 1. I slept fairly late for me. My father had arrived back at the house just as I returned from... Just as I returned from the beach, and I had gone to bed at once. So I had a good long sleep. In the morning I called Jamie, got his mother, and found out he had gone to the doctor's but would be straight back. I packed my day pack, told my father I'd be back in early evening, then set off for town. Jamie was in when I got to his house. We drank a couple of cans of the old Red Death and chatted away. Then after sharing in elevences, I don't know that word, and some of his mother's homemade cakes, I left and made my way out of town for the hills behind. High on the heathered summit, a gentle slope of rock and earth above the Forestry Commission's tree line, I sat on a big rock, ate my lunch. I looked out over the heat-hazed distance over Port Neal, the pasture land, dotted white with sheep, the dunes, the dump, the island, not that you could see it as such. It looked like part of the land, the sands and the sea. The sky held a few small clouds. It beat blue over the view, fading to paleness towards the horizon and the calm expanse of the firth and sea. Larks sung in the air above me, and I watched a buzzard hover as it looked for movement in the grass and heather. Broom and wind beneath. Insects buzzed and danced, and I waved a fan of fern in front of my face to keep them away as I ate my sandwich and drank my orange juice. To my left, the mountain peaks, the hills marched off northward, growing gradually higher as they went and fading into gray and blue, shimmering with distance. I watched the town beneath me, through binoculars, saw trucks and cars make their way along the main road, and followed a train as it headed south, stopping in the town, then going on again, snaking across the level ground before the sea. I like to get away from the island now and again, not too far. I still like to be able to see it if possible, but it is good to remove oneself sometimes and get a sense of perspective from a little further away. Of course, I know how small a piece of land it is. I'm not a fool. I know the size of the planet and just how minuscule is that part of it. I know. I've watched too much television, seen too many nature and travel programs not to appreciate how limited my own knowledge is in terms of first-hand experience of other places. But I don't want to go farther afield. I don't need to travel or see foreign climes or know different people. I know who I am. I know my limitations. I restrict my horizons for my own good reasons. Fear? Oh yes, I admit it. And a need for reassurance and safety in a world which just so happened to treat me very cruelly at an age before I had any real chance of affecting it. Also, I have the lesson of Eric. Eric went away. Eric, with all his brightness, all his intelligence and sensitivity and promise, left the island, tried to make his way, chose a path and followed it. My path led to destruction of most of what he was, changed him into a quite different person, in whom the similarities to the sane young man he had been before only appeared obscene. But he was my brother, and I still loved him anyway. I loved him despite his alteration, the way I suppose he had loved me despite my disability. That feeling of wanting to be, or wanting to protect, I suppose, which women are supposed to feel for the young men and aren't meant to feel for women. Eric left the island before I was even born, only coming back for holidays. But I think that spiritually he was always there, and when he did return properly, a year after my little accident, when my father we we both old we both old enough for him to be able to look at after the two of us, I didn't resent him being there at all. On the contrary, we got on well from the start, and I'm sure I must have embarrassed him with my slavish flowing around and copying, following around and copying. Though, being Eric, he was too sensitive to other people's feelings to tell me and risk hurting me. When he was sent off to private school, I pined. When he came back on holidays, I enthused. I jumped and bubbled and got excited. Summer after summer, we spent on the island, flying kites, making models from wood and plastic, Lego and Meccano, and anything else we found lying about. Building dams and constructing huts and trenches. We flew model airplanes, sailed model yachts, built sand yachts with sails, and even secret societies, codes, and languages. He told me stories, inventing them as we went along. We played some stories out, brave soldiers in the dunes and fighting, winning and fighting and sometimes dying. Those were the only times he deliberately hurt me. When his stories required his own heroic death, and I would take it all too seriously as he lay expiring on the grass or on the sands, having just blown up the bridge or dam or the enemy convoy, and, and like as not saved me from death. Like convoy and like as not saved me from death, too, I would choke back tears and punch him lightly as I tried to change the story myself. He refused, slipping away from me and dying, too often dying. When he had his migraines, sometimes lasting days, I lived on the edge, taking cool drinks and some food up to the darkened room on the second floor, creeping in, standing and shaking sometimes if he moaned and shifted on the bed. I was wretched while he suffered, and nothing meant anything. The only games and stories seemed stupid and pointless, and only throwing stones at bottles or seagulls made such sense. I went out fishing for goals, determined things other than Eric should suffer. When he recovered, it was like him coming back for the summer all over again, and I was impressible, irrepressible. Finally, though that outward urge consumed him, as it does any real man, and I took it took him away from me to the outside world with all its fabulous opportunities and awful dangers. Eric decided to follow his father's footsteps and become a doctor. He told me then that nothing much would change. He would still have most of the summer off, even if he would have to stay down in Glasgow to do hospital work or go around with doctors when they visited people. He told me that he would still be the same when we were together, but I knew it wasn't true, and I could see that in his heart he knew it. It was there in his eyes and his words. He was leaving the island, leaving me. I couldn't blame him even then when I felt it hardest. He was Eric. He was my brother. He was doing what he had to do, just like the brave soldier who died for the cause, or for me. How could I doubt or blame him when he had never even started to suggest that he doubted or blamed me? My God, all those murders, those three young children killed, one a fratricide. And he simply could not have entertained the idea that I had had a hand in even one of them. I would have known. He couldn't have looked at me in the face if he had suspected. He was so incapable of deceit. So south he went. First 1 year, carried there earlier by most of his brilliant examination results, and then another. The summer in between, he came back, but he was changed. He still tried to get along with me the way he always had, but I could feel it was forced. He was away from me. His heart was no longer on the island. It was with the people he knew in the university, with his studies, which he loved. It was all in the rest of the world, perhaps, but it was no longer on the island, no longer with me. We went out, we flew kites, built dams, and so on, but it wasn't the same. He was an adult helping me to enjoy myself, not another boy sharing his own joy. It wasn't a bad time, and I was still glad he was there, but he was relieved to go after a month to join some of his student friends on holiday in the south of France. I mourned what I knew was the passing of the friend and brother I had known, and felt more keenly than at any other time in my and felt more keenly than at any other time. My injury, that thing which I knew would keep me in the adolescent state forever, would never let me grow up and be a real man, able to make my own way in the world. I threw that feeling off quickly. I had the skull, I had the factory, and I had vicarious feeling of manly satisfaction in the brilliant performance of Eric on the outside, as for my part, I slowly made myself unchallenged lord of the island and the lands about it. Eric wrote me letters telling me how he was getting on. He called up and spoke to me and my father, and he would make me laugh then on the phone, the way a clever adult can, even though you might not want to let them. He never let me feel that he had totally abandoned me or the island. Then he had his unfortunate experience, which, unknown to me and my father, came on top of other things, and it was enough to kill even the altered person I knew. It was to send Eric flying back and out to something else, an amalgam of both his earlier self, but satanically reversed, and a more worldly wise man, an adult, damaged and dangerous, confused and pathetic and manic all at once. He reminded me of a hologram, shattered with the whole image contained within one spear-like shard, at once splinter and entirety. It was during the second year, when he was helping out in the big teaching hospital, that it happened. He didn't even have to be there at the time, down in the guts of the hospital with human rejects. He was helping out in his spare time. Later, my father and I heard that Eric had problems he hadn't told us about. He'd fallen for some girl, and it had ended badly, with her telling him she didn't love him after all and going off with somebody else. His migraines had been particularly bad for a while and had interfered with his work. It was because of that, as well as the girl, that he had been working unofficially in the hospital near the university, helping the nurses on late shifts, sitting in the darkness of the wards with his books, while he told books while the old and the young and the sick moaned and coughed. He was doing that at night. He had his unpleasant experience. He was doing that the night he had his unpleasant experience. The ward was one where they kept babies and young children, so badly deformed they were sure to die outside the hospital and not last much longer even inside. We got a letter explaining most of what had happened from a nurse who had been friendly with my brother, and from the tone of her letter, she thought it was wrong to keep some of the children alive. Apparently, they were little else than exhibits to be shown to students by the doctors and consultants. It was a hot, close. It was a hot, close night in July, and Eric was down in his ghoulish place near the hospital boiler room and storerooms. He had a sore head all day, and while he was in the ward, it had worsened into a bad migraine. The ventilation in the place had been faulty for the past couple of weeks, and engineers had been working on the system that night. It was hot. The system. That night it was hot and stuffy, and Eric's migraines have always been bad in those conditions. Somebody was coming to replace him in an hour or so, or I suppose even Eric would have admitted defeat and left to go back to his hall of residence and lie down. As it was, he was going around the ward, changing nappies and quieting newling babies and changing dressings and drips and whatever. His head feeling as though it was splitting and his vision distorted with lights and lines. The child he was attending to when it happened was more or less a vegetable. Amongst its other defects, it was totally incontinent, unable to make any other noise apart from a gurgle, couldn't control its muscles properly. Even its head had to be supported by a brace, and it wore a metal plate over its head because the bones which should have made up the skull never did grow together, and even the skin over its brain was paper thin. It had to be fed every few hours with some special mixture, and Eric was doing that when it happened. He had noticed that the child was a little quieter than usual, just sitting there slackly in its chair and staring straight ahead, breathing lightly, eyes glazed, and an almost peaceful expression on its unusually vacant face. It seemed to be incapable of taking its food, though one of the few activities that normally it was able to appreciate and even join in. Eric was patient and held the spoon in front of its unfocused eyes. He put it to its lips where normally the child would have put a tongue out or tried to lean forward and take the spoon into its mouth. But that night it just sat there, not gurgling, not shaking its head, not shifting or flapping its arms or rolling its eyes, but staring and staring and staring and staring, that curious look on its face which might have been mistaken for happiness. Eric preserved sitting closer, trying to ignore the pressing pain in his head as the migraine got gradually worse. He spoke gently to the child. Sometimes that would normally get it to swivel its eyes and shift its head towards the source of the noise, but which that night had no effect at all. Eric checked the sheet of paper by the chair to see if the child had been given any extra medication, but everything appeared normal. He edged closer, crooning, waving the spoon, fighting the waves of pain inside his skull. Then he saw something like a movement, just a tiny little movement, barely visible on the shaved head of the slightly smiling child. Whatever it was small and slow. Eric blinked, shook his head to try to dissolve the quivering lights of the migraine building inside. He stood up, still holding the spoon with the mushy food on it. He bent closer to the skull of the child, looking closer. He couldn't see anything, but he looked around the edge of the metal skull cap that the child wore, thought he saw something under it, and lifted it easily from the head of the infant to see if there was anything wrong. The boiler room worker heard Eric screaming and rushed into the ward, brandishing a big spanner. He found Eric crammed into a corner, howling as hard as he could at the floor, his head down between his knees as the half-knelt, half-lay photo on the tiles. The chair the child was in had been tipped over, and the strapped-in child, who was still smiling, lay on the floor a few yards away. The man from the boiler room shook Eric, but got no response. Then he looked at the child on the chair and went over to it, perhaps to right its chair. He got within a couple of feet and then rushed to the door, throwing up before he got there. A ward sister from the floor above found the man in the corridor still fighting his dry heaves when she came down to see what all the fuss was about. Eric had stopped screaming by that time and gone quiet. The child was still smiling. The sister righted the child's chair, whether she choked back any of her own sickness or felt dizzy or whatever she had seen as bad or worse before, and treated it as just something to be coped with. I don't know, but finally pulled things together, calling for help on the telephone and getting Eric stiffly out of his corner. She put him in a seat, covered the child's head with a towel, and comforted the workman. She had removed the spoon from the open skull of the smiling infant. Eric had stuck it there, perhaps thinking that it was in that first instant of his mania to spoon out what he saw. Flies had got into the ward, presumably when the air conditioning had been faulty earlier. They had got underneath the stainless steel of the child's skull cap and deposited their eggs there. What Eric saw when he lifted that plate, what he saw with all the weight of a human suffering above, with all the mighty spread of closed-in, heat-struck, darkened city around, what he saw with his own skull splitting was a slowly withering nest of fat maggots, swimming in their combined digestive juices as they consumed the brain of the child.